It was the spring of 2000, and I was living in a loft apartment in Boulder, Colorado. My place had a huge window overlooking the majestic Rocky Mountains, a view to be envied. However, it was a bit noisy, especially when it rained, as the roof leaked a little, and the air conditioning sounded like a freight train. Even so, it was a cozy place. At the time, I was writing for a newspaper, and after my day as a cashier at a hardware store, I would spend a couple of hours editing my articles before going to sleep, usually between 1 and 2 in the morning. Next door, there was another empty loft that had been unoccupied for years, until a middle-aged woman with her bunch of cats finally decided to move in. On the second floor, it was just us, but our apartments had no numbers or anything to distinguish them. It was a minor detail for me because I didn't receive much correspondence at home either, but that lack of information proved to be confusing and almost cost me my life. One night, while I was writing, listening to Italian music in the background, I suddenly felt like filling my glass with wine. As he passed by my door on impulse, I looked through the peephole without thinking too much about it. I don't know what I expected to see as it was nighttime, but sometimes curiosity gets the better of you. But what I found was anything but reassuring. In front of my door was a short, bald guy with gloved hands but no shoes on. I remember his gray socks making a strange contrast with the dark wooden floor. The man was wearing a mustard-colored jacket and light-colored jeans, and he seemed to be trying to open my neighbor's door. My heart skipped a beat. I had no idea who he was. I had never seen him in the building, but it was his behavior that really made me uncomfortable. He was clearly trying to force the doorknob, moving it from side to side, as if he was waiting for the door to open by itself. I stood there watching him for at least 30 or 40 seconds, trying to stay calm and trying not to make any noise. I thought that if he managed to open that door, I would have to run to get my cell phone to call 911. However, after a while of trying unsuccessfully, he let go of the knob and bent down to open a backpack he had on the floor. At that moment, I got a better look at his face. He was an older guy, about 50 or so, and he had a disturbing air about him that gave me the creeps. My hands began to sweat. I still had my drink in one of them, so in a slow motion I moved away from the door and put the glass down on the table. I returned to the door, pressing both hands against the surface of the wood, as if that could protect me from the stranger. Then I looked through the peephole again, and I almost fell over backwards. The man was right there, looking at me, with a suspicious expression on his face and holding a screwdriver in his left hand. My heart started beating like crazy, so much so that I thought I could hear it through the door. The lights in my apartment were off, except for the lamp on my desk, which dimly illuminated the hallway, and I realized that the man would probably have seen the faint glow through the peephole. As I became aware of this, a cold sweat started running down my back, and just at that moment, he took 2 more steps forward and began to shake the doorknob. Panic overcame me, and I did the first thing that came to mind to try to keep myself safe. I held the doorknob on my side, pressing down with all my weight, although I knew that if I managed to open it, I wouldn't be able to stop him from coming in. At that moment, it felt as if the door was as thin as paper. He felt very close, so close that I thought I could hear him breathing. He shook the knob a couple more times, but thank God it didn't open. After all, the fact that I was also holding the handle, pushing against it, was having some effect. However, I was very, very far from feeling safe. I was terrified, feeling the situation becoming more and more extreme. I stood still for a moment, thinking about what I would do if he really managed to open that door, knowing that what was between him and me at that moment was not just wood. It was a thin barrier between life and what could be my end. In the midst of the panic, I looked through the peephole again, only to find his eyes fixed on me once more. His eyes were an icy blue, and they had a dark sparkle that made me feel that his plans were truly sinister, either for me or for my neighbor. But then, the least expected happened. The guy knocked on my door. 3 soft knocks, and I heard him mutter something under his breath. I couldn't believe it. Maybe he was just looking for a reaction, having fun with the whole thing, but I was petrified, unable to move or speak. Seriously, I could hardly breathe. I was already sure that he was aware of my presence because when I was on the other side of the room, there was no way I could hear him without being right there next to him. Finally, he stood motionless in front of me for what felt like an eternity. Then after about 10 seconds, he picked up his backpack and walked to the stairs, moving noiselessly thanks to the fact that he was barefoot. I was so scared that I didn't dare turn my back on the door, convinced that he would come back up any moment. So I counted to 20 in my head to calm down, and after taking a deep breath, I crossed the room to my desk, grabbed my old Nokia and called the police, whispering as if that could protect me. I told the operator that there was a strange man outside my door, and when I had been talking for a little over a minute, she told me that a patrol car was on its way. I looked out the window and saw the bald man standing on the sidewalk below me, and when he noticed that I was watching him, he waved at me and then slipped away down an alley. I almost had a heart attack and immediately informed the operator where he had gone. The police arrived a few minutes later, minutes that were slow and agonizing. They questioned me and my neighbor Charlene. It turned out that she had called the police earlier because she had seen shadows moving under her door thanks to the light in the hallway. And that's when she dropped a bombshell. The neighbor revealed that she was in the witness protection program. Before dawn, 2 FBI guys showed up and took her and her cats away, and I never saw her again. The next day, I went to the police station and gave a description of the man to a forensic artist, but then I heard nothing more about the case. To this day, I wonder if that stranger was specifically looking for Charlene, or if he was just a common thief hanging around, and the rest was a coincidence. If I had to guess, I wouldn't believe he was just a typical thief. My theory is that since there were no numbers on the doors, he was confused about which apartment was hers and decided to try his luck on several. Nothing was ever heard from him again. All I have are my suspicions, but sometimes I think that my neighbor could have been linked to something more sinister. When I spoke to the police, I realized that her accent was from Boston, and that same year later, the scandal of Whitey Bulger and his Winter Hill gang broke out. Then it all exploded on the news, with details about murders and the corruption of an FBI agent named John Connolly. The next day, I put 3 more locks on my door. I never saw that guy or any other stranger in my house again, thank God. I spent another 4 years there, and the loft next door was never rented out again. I wanted to tell this story as a reminder that you should always trust your instincts. Don't fool yourself into thinking you're safe just because you're at home. If you feel something strange is going on, don't ignore it. Some time ago, I came home after work to find my girlfriend sitting on the sofa, glowing with a strange energy on her face. When I asked her what was going on, she gave me the classic line, "We need to talk." In that moment, I knew that things weren't right. She told me that she was no longer happy in our relationship and that she thought we should take a break to see other people, as if that would help us decide whether we really had to be together or should break up. Honestly, I didn't want to do that, but I loved her enough to respect what she said. So although it hurt, I accepted. I thought that maybe if I gave her the chance to try being apart for a while, she might change her mind. But unfortunately, a few weeks later, we were already over, and I found myself in the difficult situation of having to move out of the apartment we shared, as it was officially hers alone. So in a hurry, I started looking for a place to stay. Due to the haste and the unpreparedness of the situation, I didn't take the time to find a decent place and ended up renting a one-bedroom apartment in a building that looked like a mix between a homeless shelter and a haunted house. But it was cheap and had immediate availability. That should probably have been a warning sign, but I was in such a hurry to get out of my ex's apartment that I didn't pay attention to those details, or not right away. The landlord only asked me for a month's rent in advance in exchange for the keys, and there was no way I could go back home to my parents. Imagine how that would have felt. Too much like a step backwards, so I opted for that small studio, which at least seemed better than going back to my family. I didn't want to argue with my ex about who got which piece of furniture, because we'd already been through enough drama. As long as I could take my Xbox and my smart TV, I thought I could survive. One day, shortly after moving in, I decided to introduce myself to my neighbor. I could hear a loud beat of music coming from his apartment, so I went over and knocked. But when he opened the door, I was surprised at how unfriendly he was. He was a young guy with a thick, dark beard and an accent that reminded me of London. The guy didn't open the door all the way, just a little space for me to look at him. I introduced myself and told him that I had moved across the hall, and that if he ever needed anything, to let me know. But I only received a cold and nervous look in return. I got the impression that maybe I was interrupting him in something, and it seemed to me that he was just improvising a name when he told me his name was Jesse. Something inside me went off like a little alarm, but I'm not one to generate paranoia for no reason, so I tried to ignore it and get on with my life. However, a few weeks later, I was leaving for work and I noticed a guy coming out of Jesse's apartment. For some reason, the guy gave me a kind of bad feeling, but I ignored it and greeted him, and he returned the greeting in a careless manner. I asked him if he was a friend of Jesse's or his roommate, and that's when the air became thicker, as I could smell the strong smell of alcohol on his breath. The guy replied that he was Jesse, and I wasn't convinced by that answer, but he repeated the statement, claiming he was Jesse Smite. I let it go and continued down the stairs, but I knew he was lying, and that made everything feel strange. The situation continued to develop, as in the following weeks I noticed different guys coming in and out of Jesse's apartment at all hours, and my suspicions intensified. Finally, when the landlord came to collect the rent for the following month, I mentioned the tenants next door and asked him who lived there. The man scratched his head for a second and finally said that his name was Steven, and that he was the best tenant he had ever had. He paid on time and there were no noise complaints or problems of any kind, so everything was perfect. That left me somewhat confused, but now I had a suspicion. I was about to tell him about the different people I had seen in that apartment, but I stopped. I didn't want to get into other people's problems, and although this sounded a bit shady, it wasn't my place to play detective. I've never been one to meddle in other people's business, so I decided to keep my mouth shut. After all, as long as it didn't harm me or anyone else, there was no reason for me to get involved. Although I really wish I hadn't found myself in that situation. A week later, I was in my bed fast asleep when a noise woke me up. It was like someone walking very heavily up the stairs, and somehow I knew it had something to do with Jesse's apartment across the hall. As I tried to clear my head, I decided it was time to complain to the landlord, but just as I was thinking about it, I heard loud bangs on my door. It was as if they wanted to break it down. "Police, open the door or we'll break it down." My heart started beating so fast I could feel it in every corner of my body, and I was paralyzed. What the hell is the police doing in my apartment? I asked myself, but I didn't understand anything. I just had a hunch it had to do with Jesse's apartment. A few seconds of panic passed before I finally managed to gather my strength and ran to the door, pulling on the lock before opening it. The next thing I know, a bright light blinded me, and when I could adjust my vision, I saw that there was a group of policemen in the doorway, armed and wearing tactical vests. Without saying a word, one of them pushed me to the ground, quickly handcuffing me while shouting at me to stay still. After a moment in that uncomfortable position, with my face against the ground, I heard another officer say that they were trying to open the apartment opposite, yes, Jesse's, but no one was responding, and the tension in the air was growing by the second. A policeman took out some kind of tool to force the lock while they shouted for silence. Then, in a chilling turn of events, an officer came out of that apartment, dragging a girl who didn't seem to be over 17. She was covered in bruises and her hair was a mess, completely disheveled. I felt the world crashing down on me when I saw her. Then I looked at one of the officers in horror and said, "Officer," but he didn't let me finish. He interrupted me saying, "Let me guess. You didn't know anything about this." "I swear I didn't," I said to him, horrified, and with my voice barely above a whisper, but he, with a cold expression, replied, "Save that for the interview." And at that moment, something broke inside me. They took me to the station, and there was a sea of questions. There were a lot of rumors about human trafficking rings, and panic took hold of me. I cried as they tried to make me confess to something I hadn't done, and I swore to them that I didn't understand anything they were talking about, that I would never get involved in something like that. When they finally let me go, I was horrified to realize that all this had been going on right under my nose. As I was smiling and chatting with my neighbors, the cruel reality of what was happening behind those doors hit me like a train. Luckily, the victim herself absolved me of guilt. She corroborated to the officers that I was not one of the men involved in her kidnapping. It broke my heart to know that this poor girl had been kidnapped and sold to the highest bidder by a bunch of degenerates. Not long after, I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I moved back in with my parents because the paranoia of not knowing what was going on around me was too overwhelming. It was easy for me to shake off the stress of my breakup because now I couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened in that place. My experience makes it clear that even if you sometimes feel paranoid, it's better to speak up if something doesn't seem right. Whether it's calling the police or asking questions, it's important. Their decisions can make the difference between life and death, between someone's freedom and a life of horror behind those doors. So please, never keep quiet if you feel something stinks. Sometimes the chance to do the right thing can save someone from a terrifying fate. Autumn was coming and the nights were getting longer. I was alone in the house I shared with my roommate, and with the depression typical of the season, I decided to stay inside and have one of those lazy nights. I was lying on the sofa browsing Netflix when suddenly I got a horrible feeling, as if something wasn't right. But it wasn't just the typical bad feeling of not doing anything, no. I felt as if the world was falling apart. A bit like when you feel a tire is losing air while driving. That's more or less how I could describe it. Puzzled and a little anxious, I stopped watching TV and went upstairs, leaving the lights on downstairs. When I reached the top floor, I turned on the hall light and went into the bathroom. I didn't feel like I was being watched, but there was something unsettling, as if the atmosphere had changed. So I decided to put on some music on my phone and take a shower to distract myself from that strange feeling that was weighing on me for no apparent reason. If I had had pets, I probably would have looked at them to see how they reacted. But I didn't have any. Instead, I tried to ignore the discomfort that was invading me. Just as I was about to undress, I thought I heard a noise coming from downstairs, so I silenced the music for a moment, but the noise didn't come back. I figured I was imagining things or that my roommate had come back early. I didn't think for a second that a stranger could have entered my house. Those things happened to others, not to me. I felt confident because I knew that all my doors were locked and that I lived in a quiet neighborhood. I got in the shower and tried to relax, but the feeling of unease returned. So I got out, turned off my phone, and when I looked towards the bathroom door, I noticed a shadow standing just outside. The only thing separating that figure from me was the old wooden door with its latch, which any fool could break with enough force. The person on the other side wasn't knocking or making any noise. You couldn't even hear them breathing, which made my skin crawl. Who or what was this figure, and what were they doing in my house? How did they get in without me noticing? I wondered, as I stood motionless, cold sweat starting to run down my forehead. In a moment of panic, I decided I had to act. So I slowly got out of the shower and thought it would be best to go out the window. Very carefully, I opened the bathroom window, pulled the frame and slipped outside, but as I hung my legs through the opening, I hit them against the blinds and they echoed, creating a noise that resonated throughout the room. In an instant, I heard the bathroom door opening right behind me as I tried to climb down from the ceiling. When I finally hit the patio floor, I got up and ran to my neighbor's house without looking back. I knocked on the back door until they let me in, and once inside, I called the police. When they finally arrived, they searched my house but found it empty. However, each room showed signs that someone had been rummaging through my things, digging through my drawers and going through my belongings. The officers informed me that the intruder had been wandering from room to room while I was in the shower, and they found a trail of DNA that indicated that he had been watching me while I was relaxing on the sofa. The guy had been waiting for me to fall asleep so he could enter through the back door. He could have caught me in the bathroom, but he decided to bide his time. He just didn't count on me sneaking out the window. Knowing this, I realized that things could have gone wrong in so many different ways that night. If I hadn't listened to my instinct and stayed, if I had turned off the lights behind me, or if the visitor had simply acted sooner, the end of the story could have been very different. There is something surprising about how life can change from one second to the next. With a simple roll of the dice, it could have been a different number of fatalities. Now, I don't know who that guy was or why he chose my house, but I've learned a clear lesson. I will never again doubt my instincts. So, for everyone who hears this, please stay alert. Always be aware of your surroundings, play it safe even if you feel a little silly, and never ignore that little whisper in your head that tells you something isn't right. It might save your life. It had been almost a year since I finished high school, and honestly, I didn't really want to go to university or join the army. So there I was, trapped in my boring hometown, mired in a fatal routine that seemed to be inherited. My days were spent between Xanax and a few drinks, and to be honest, I felt like I was doomed to repeat the family story. I knew it was time to escape, so I decided to sign up for a website about agricultural opportunities, something I found on the web, a page that offers you a program where you can work on farms in exchange for food and lodging. The destination I chose was a Hare Krishna community in the deep south of the United States. On arrival, my old Camry, which I bought secondhand for about $600, decided to break down immediately, and the nearest town was about 20 miles away. So there I was, stuck among a group of hipsters who make you want to scream. A third of the community were Indian immigrants, and there were some old people legitimately seeking a spiritual experience, but most seemed more focused on doing yoga and talking about their awakening while sitting in their patronizing bubble. I tried to stay out of it, but sometimes I was dragged into talks about crystals and energies. I was desperate for a more real conversation, and just at that moment, I met a guy called Samuel. I had heard about him a few days earlier. People said he was lazy and a bit weird, that he spent hours locked up doing yoga in his room instead of helping out on the farm. However, one night he arrived completely late, saying that he wanted to get more involved in agriculture. Samuel was a guy in his early 30s, with the look of a Hasidic rabbi and curly loop sideburns, and his way of speaking was like a cartoon character, always interrupting his sentences with and like. But overall, he was a good guy. We became friends very quickly, maybe because we were the only ones from Texas in the community and we could swap stories about our high school teachers, the popular places all Texans go, and those things that make us who we are. We also talked about soccer and, of course, beers and drugs. He had crazy plans, even talked about using bombs and telepathy to fix his car that was stuck in the garage. He claimed that he had come there to be friends with the gurus and learn about a form of meditation that allowed him to control people. At one point, he mentioned that he had supposedly used Reiki to seduce a girl at a party, and that's when I understood why he had that reputation for being strange. The craziest thing is that he took it all so seriously, but I found his enthusiasm funny. I knew that one day I would reach a point where I couldn't stand it anymore, but I decided to put up with it for a couple more days to have someone to entertain myself with. One day, during lunch with one of the gurus, I told Samuel about my trip to a farm that used to be the headquarters of a famous cult, the Branch Davidians of Waco. I didn't know if he knew the story, so I told him about the shootout, the FBI siege, and all the drama. But when I told him about the deaths, he went ballistic. He believed that the government was targeting people who preached the truth, and he was mad as hell. At that moment, I really wanted to explain to him that the leader of that cult was not a martyr, but a sociopath who was only seeking power, but he was not on the same page. At one point, the argument got a bit tense, and I was getting annoyed with his way of seeing things, because every time I tried to explain the real story to him, he would just shake his head and say I was wrong. It was like being trapped in an endless cycle of his tantrum. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore and got up from the table. I decided to go back to work on the farm, hoping that the air would cool me down a bit, but surprisingly, he followed me. And after another half an hour of wanting to pull my hair out because of the absurd argument, I decided I'd had enough. So I turned around and said angrily, "Look, I'm not going to have this discussion with you anymore. I can't expect a guy who came here looking for superpowers to have any logic in his head." When I said this, Samuel looked at me with an anger I had never seen in anyone before and lunged at me. Samuel was a big guy, much taller and older than me, so I didn't stand a chance in a fight. So I ran back to the room, but he chased me. At that moment, I started to check my pockets, wishing I had grabbed the knife before leaving the cabin. I know it sounds crazy, but in my old neighborhood, you didn't go out without some kind of protection. Besides, on the farm, it was a pretty useful tool, so it's always good to carry it. Fortunately, I had taken it, so I took it out and threatened Samuel with it to leave me alone. At that moment, I saw him hesitate. He stood still for a few seconds and then went back to finish his lunch. The next day, I went to find the temple leader and told him what had happened, suggesting that maybe we should do something with him. After all, nobody cared much about him, and he wasn't helping at all on the farm. Then the leader told me that he was also a recovering alcoholic who had been dealing with his demons for more than 10 years and had escaped to this farm in search of sobriety. The strange thing was that he never told me that, even though we had already established a relationship of trust. That afternoon, I saw someone bringing him suitcases from my window. Samuel was getting ready to leave, and that left me a little confused. But the truth is that the atmosphere began to clear up a bit when he left. A few weeks had passed since Michael left, and I had almost completely forgotten about the whole thing. But one night I received a text message. "Hi, this is Samuel. Can we take my car out for $280? I want to leave." I didn't reply. I didn't really understand the message either, and having no idea how he had got my number, I thought maybe he had looked me up on social media or something. Whatever it was weird, but not as weird as what happened a couple of nights later. A few nights later, I was in the temple office using the Wi-Fi to send some emails, and when I returned to my cabin, I heard some huge noises coming from the barn. At the time, I thought it was probably just an animal, but if it was an animal, it definitely had to be a huge one. I didn't think much of it and went into my hut, which didn't have a lock, but the door to my room was secure. I felt a little uncomfortable about the banging, but I thought I was overreacting. Later that night, I woke up needing to go to the bathroom, but the cabin didn't have a bathroom. We only had a shared outhouse. However, I didn't feel like putting on my shoes and going out into the dark, so I decided I'd rather urinate in the sink. I know it's disgusting, but I was the only one using the kitchen, so what did it matter? But when I opened the door to my room, I almost had a heart attack. There was Samuel, completely naked and crouching in the corner of the kitchen facing the wall. I made an involuntary sound, just like a noise you might hear in one of those Scooby-Doo cartoons. My noise alerted him, and all he did was look at me and shake his body, which looked like an old tree about to fall. In an instant, I closed the door and locked it, knowing exactly what he was trying to do, to calm me down with one of his meditation or Reiki techniques. Without thinking, I called 911, and I didn't open the door or go anywhere near it until I saw the red and blue lights illuminating my window. By the time the police arrived, Samuel was gone. I guess he got lost in the woods. I immediately told them what had happened, but there wasn't much they could do. Nobody knew anything about him, not even his last name. I had to leave the farm shortly afterwards. Calling the police here was something very frowned upon. All those old hippies still seemed to be evading military recruitment or something like that, and to be honest, I wasn't worried about what they thought. All I wanted was to get out of there. I could never sleep with the idea that Samuel was still missing in those woods, perhaps angrier than before. So I stayed awake for days, hoping that my friend would come to pick me up soon, and when he finally did, I got the hell out of there and never went back. Fortunately, I never heard from Samuel again, but it was certainly one of the most terrifying and bizarre experiences of my life. I come from a beautiful city in the northwest of my country called Nunes Nagara. People call it the City of Flowers, and to be honest, I love it. But I can't stay there anymore. That place is full of painful memories, and people unfairly blame me for something I didn't do. About 5 years ago, I lived next door to a family called the Necromancers, who seemed like very nice people, and they were in financial difficulties, but it was the complete opposite. Mr. Hector, the father of the Negromonte family, couldn't find work, and the reason for this was a mystery to everyone. Although many in the neighborhood whispered that he had health problems, and that this was the reason he didn't have a job, others said that he was a scoundrel who didn't like to work and other such things. Despite these comments, I knew that Mr. Hector was a hard-working man and did what he could to support his family, making and selling cakes to the neighbors. And among those neighbors was me. The neighbor had a special talent for making rudos y salgados, which are Brazilian cakes that no one can resist. Hector would often come to my door with a tray full of these colorful delicacies. My stomach would curl up in happiness. They were tasty and very affordable, so it wasn't just me who bought them from him. The whole neighborhood was hooked on his products. To be honest, I felt good about helping him support his family, and I got to know him a little better during those times. Sometimes I did hear people say that Hector was a bit crazy, and sometimes he seemed to have physical problems too. It was weird, because when he came to my house to sell his delicious cakes, he would laugh for no reason, as if he had heard the best joke in the world. However, there was one occasion that stuck in my mind when that laughter turned into something terrifying. I remember once I saw him have a nosebleed while offering me his cakes. Then he apologized a lot, looking worried. And he left my door in a hurry, but at the same time he was laughing again, which left me confused. I couldn't get the image of his eerie laugh out of my mind. Mr. Hector had his oddities, but I felt sorry for him. I appreciated his efforts to keep his family working hard, so I tried to ignore how weird he could be and to overlook the bad comments. However, one day I came home after leaving work and found a police presence in front of the Negromonte house. The whole neighborhood came out to see what was happening. Everyone was wondering what had happened, while others speculated. To my surprise, I saw that a forensic team also arrived, all dressed in white, like in crime movies. That's when my stomach twisted. It was clear that something serious had happened to that family. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said that a murder had taken place, although no one really knew what was happening. It was just the suspicions of some neighbors, until the news began to filter through. Within days, the photos were all over the city's newspapers. The news was a scandal all over the place. It turned out that human remains had been found in the Negromonte's backyard, which were identified as belonging to a homeless girl named Barbara, who had been missing for a few months. No one could believe it. Hector was a family man, a kind and loving man. How could he be capable of such a cruel act? The news was very disturbing. It was discovered that the family had called Barbara with the lie that they needed a babysitter to look after their little boy. But then they had cruelly killed her and hidden her in their garden. It was a total shock to everyone in the neighborhood, as no one could believe that someone like Hector, who had always been a good citizen, could have done something so horrible. That news changed my view of Nunes Nagara forever. It was no longer the city of flowers, but the site of a tragedy. Now, instead of flowers, there are echoes of a bad memory that pushed me to want to leave that city behind. It was best to stay away from that creepy place and what had happened, even though the memories still haunt me sometimes. We were all shocked by the news, but that was just the beginning of an even greater horror. I remember one day the police organized a press conference that brought together reporters from all over. They said they had found a 65-page notebook written by Hector, the Negromonte's father. In it, he revealed terrifying things, as if he were speaking from the mind of a completely deranged person. The guy claimed that he heard voices inciting him to murder women, and that it was all part of a satanic purification ritual with a plan to reduce the world's population. It was totally disturbing, and to be honest, I never imagined that Hector could think like that, as he always seemed like a kind, honest guy to me, but he was clearly wrong. As the weeks went by, the situation became even darker. Forensics searched every corner of the house and found remains of the woman who had died in the kitchen. Yes, you heard right. They had found parts of her body and even pieces of flesh on other bodies in their backyard. The police's conclusion left everyone speechless. The family was killing women and then cooking them to get rid of the evidence. But that wasn't all. Rumors began to circulate that they were not only practicing cannibalism but also selling some of the meat in pies and savory pastries. Imagine how horrible it was for me to realize that, on multiple occasions, I had bought those cakes from the neighbor I admired so much and had eaten them. They were so good, so I never thought they could be made of something so creepy. I remember being on my couch when I got that news. My head started spinning and I felt completely paralyzed. Suddenly, everything fitted together in a horrible way. I had eaten human flesh without knowing it. I ran to the bathroom and ended up throwing up everything I had in my stomach. It was a total trauma. And as if all this wasn't enough, even more terrifying rumors began to circulate about our community. They said that we were all part of a satanic cult and that, although we didn't know it, we were accomplices of what the Negromonte family did. People from all over the city came to our neighborhood, accusing anyone who lived there of cannibalism, including me. They called us to insult us and throw things at us, and they made us feel as if we no longer had a place in the community. I received an anonymous note on my door saying that they would kill me in revenge if I didn't leave the city. So I decided it wasn't worth the risk. So I packed my bags. I moved to a small coastal town, far from all the disaster and horror I had experienced. Since then, I have become a vegetarian. I can't bear the idea of eating meat. Just tasting it makes me feel nauseous and brings back terrifying memories. So yes, now you understand why I don't want to share my name or give out too much information about where I live. I'm afraid that people who are looking for revenge for the crimes of Hector Negromonte will come looking for me. I swear to you that I had no idea what I was eating. If I had known, I would have reported Hector to the police myself right away. This leads me to reflect. Do you really know your neighbors? Can you know what they do behind those closed doors? For many of us, the truth about our neighbors is revealed only when it is too late. You never know who might be hiding a dark secret, so stay alert. Tranquility can be just a facade. The story I'm going to tell you is not just scary, it's rather sad, so don't be fooled. There were moments when my mind went crazy with terror, but what I really want is to make you think or make you a little aware of the danger that sharing a flat with some crazy people can be. So if you can, turn off the lights and make yourself comfortable, because here comes the story of my most creepy and terrifying flatmate. A few years ago, after I graduated from high school, my parents gave me an ultimatum. You're a man now. Start paying rent or find your own place. Of course, I wasn't going to pay them to live in their house, so I started looking for an apartment right away, feeling like a real man. The best thing was that I was lucky enough to have worked for a couple of years and had some money saved up. I guess my parents thought I would stay with them for a while longer, but this was my chance to escape and be independent. It wasn't long before I found a place to stay, thanks to a work friend who needed to get his roommate out as he hadn't paid his share of the rent. The owner of the apartment, named Xander, seemed like a great guy, the nicest I had ever met. The good thing is that we were quite similar, and we worked different shifts, so our routines fitted together very well. In the first few months, everything flowed smoothly. We spent our days off lying on the sofa, playing Halo and drinking beers, like two carefree men. Everything was normal, until one night, I got a huge fright. That night I came home after a 12-hour shift, more tired than ever. I wasn't sure what time it was, but suddenly a loud knock on my door woke me up with a jolt. Dazed and sleepy, I turned to see what was going on. And there was Xander. His pale, expressionless face made me jump with fright. My heart was racing. I was in shock for a couple of seconds. My eyes couldn't believe what I was seeing. And after catching my breath, I shouted at him, "Dude!" But to my surprise, there was no response. I felt a chill that shook my whole body. Xander looked like a statue, just staring straight ahead, mute and disconnected from reality. In that moment, I realized that he was sleepwalking. I relaxed a little, so it crossed my mind to wake him up, but I remembered that that could be dangerous. So in an act of compassion, I carefully guided him back to his room. When we arrived, I told him to get into bed, and miraculously, he did, which was a relief to me. I was more than satisfied with myself, but also completely exhausted. I returned to my room, closed the door, and the night passed without incident. A couple of days passed, and when I saw my roommate again, I decided to mention the matter. I didn't know if he was aware of what I was doing or if the news would make him a little uncomfortable. To my relief, Xander took it well. "Yeah, man," he said with a laugh. "Since I was a kid, and I do it more when I'm stressed." He explained that it wasn't unusual for him and that although it could be scary for others, it wasn't something he worried about. He apologized for the scare and assured me that he had handled the situation well. However, he did recommend that I lock his bedroom door to avoid future scares. In the end, there was no guarantee that the lock would make any difference, but I thought it was a good idea. Another 4 months or so passed without any strange events until one night the ghost reappeared. I was ready, and as before, I guided him back to his room carefully. I was relieved because I knew it was normal for him, and at the same time a little calmer because I knew how to handle the situation. Life went on, and although he was still terrified from time to time, we got on well. However, I was beginning to think that maybe living with someone who was a sleepwalker was not the best life plan. Maybe next time, it would be better to look for a place without having to share an apartment. Several weeks passed, and after thinking about all this, I realized that it was silly to be annoyed by his sleep disorder. I couldn't control what my roommate did, and besides, there were ways to keep him at bay at night. So I thought I could implement measures and techniques. And once I implemented those measures, my nights of startling would be over. Setting myself the goal of putting an end to the sleepwalking phenomenon, and that it would no longer be a concern for me. But I was wrong. Then several days went by and I was just thinking about how I was going to put an end to my roommate's sleepwalking. I researched it on the internet for almost a whole week. Then I got a call from work saying that I had to take a vacation. And on December 1st, when I returned from that short vacation that they had forced me to take from work, and it had only lasted 3 days, my mood was at rock bottom because on my return I remembered that all my vacation plans had been ruined, because I had intended to combine those days with others that I had free until January. But instead of that, there I was, lying on the sofa, doing nothing. After a while, I remembered that I had to continue researching sleepwalking, just as I was about to get down to work. Suddenly, my phone rang and I saw the number on the screen. I was amazed and took a deep breath to prepare for the worst. It was my boss, and of course, his first line was to ask about Xander, my roommate. "He didn't show up for work today," he said. I hadn't told him yet that I hadn't seen him since I got back. My boss asked me to check his room, so I had no choice but to do it because besides being my boss, he was also my friend. So I headed to his room, slowly opened the door and looked around. The bed was a mess, which was strange for him. Xander was always very tidy and extremely punctual. After that, I told my boss that apparently he hadn't arrived yet, and promising that I would call him if I saw him, I hung up and immediately tried to contact Xander, but he wasn't answering my calls. So I left a voice message and went on with my day, although I was already feeling uneasy. When night came, he still hadn't shown any sign of life, and that was unusual for him. The next day, I was feeling quite worried, so I decided to go into his room again to see if he had returned. But nothing had changed. His room was the same as before. I was definitely getting concerned because his behavior was totally strange. After knowing him for a while, I was starting to wonder if he had a dark side that I had never seen, or if something had really happened to him. As I was leaving the apartment to go to work, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I thought maybe it was Xander and he needed help, so I answered, trying to save the laughter for a better time. As I answered, I heard an unexpected voice. It was a guy who introduced himself as Detective James from the Littleton Police Department. He immediately caught my attention and I replied with a "What's going on?" He told me that he had been in a car accident and that Xander had died. In that moment, my world fell apart. What? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I was speechless, and the detective asked again if I was still on the line. After catching my breath, I finally said, "Yes, I'm here. What happened?" The detective went on to explain that Xander had crashed into a power pole and was on the road in a very strange state. I explained that this was weird, as he was usually always at home. Then the detective asked me another question that left me stunned. Was it normal for him to be out at that time? "He should be sleeping. He never goes out at night," I replied, feeling that something was not right. After a moment of silence, an idea struck me. "It can't be. Are you saying he was sleepwalking at the wheel?" I dared to ask. The detective confirmed what I thought. He was driving asleep. The conversation went on for a while, and in the end, the difficult moment came when I had to call Xander's parents to give them the bad news. They lived in Pueblo, so they prepared to come the next day. His body was taken back to his hometown, and the funeral was organized 3 days later. His loss was palpable, and it was clear how much he was loved by everyone who knew him. Our bosses decided to stop work for the day so that everyone could attend the funeral. I'm not a fan of funerals, but this was one I simply couldn't miss. Saying goodbye to my best friend was the least I could do for him. So that's how I found myself at the funeral, surrounded by people who also missed him. Sadness permeated the atmosphere, and everyone shared stories and memories of Xander. We cried, laughed, and remembered that kind and funny boy who had made such an impact on our lives. Sometimes life throws you terrifying and tragic surprises. There may be times when you think there is no improvement, but remembering those we have lost helps us to move on. Life is fragile, and that reality can be quite hard. But in those dark moments, we will always remember the brightness that those friends brought to our lives. In time, all the details of what had happened were revealed. It turns out that Xander, who I was worrying about because of his strange behavior, had crashed his car just after leaving his room. I had no idea that sleepwalking could take you so far. After talking to my doctor, I understood how serious sleepwalking could be, and hallucinating when driving was really dangerous. I honestly can't help feeling a little guilty about what happened. Maybe if we had talked more about it, we could have taken some precautions. But let's face it, with two 22-year-olds, one of us probably would have fallen asleep on the sofa after a night of video games and beers, leaving the doors unlocked and all that. Now, after a few months, I decided it was time to let go. My girlfriend and I found a place to live together, and I guess I stayed in that apartment for so long because it made the loss of Xander feel even more real. My girlfriend and I did a lot of things that he and I used to do, and we had a great time, almost like old times. But as it went on, I realized that as long as I was in that place, I would never accept that he was gone. So last month, I made the decision to leave the place. I passed it on to a couple of young guys at work who had been having trouble finding an apartment. I remembered how difficult it had been for me at the time, so I really hoped they enjoy that space as much as we did. Hopefully their friendship doesn't end in such a heartbreaking way as ours did. So there you have it. A terrifying experience with a little friendship thrown in for good measure. In the end, we all have our weird sides, and learning tolerance can be one of the hardest things to do. I just hope this story makes you think about what it really means to get to know someone and what lies behind every closed door.